Good morning. We welcome you to the Board of Trustees meeting for the Utah Transit Authority. Today is Wednesday, June the 3rd of 2020. And we note that our meeting is currently being broadcast by streaming due to COVID-19 circumstances, and we've received public comment prior to this meeting and certainly welcome it afterwards. Today, unfortunately, we have a tribute to a former or to an employee who has passed away, a tribute to Martin Baker. Martin Baker is a member of UTA's Maintenance of Way Systems team, and understandably has come to our attention, was quite the character. Always early for his shift, Marty would come in each day to chat and check in before his shift. He loved his cats, was very intelligent, and always willing to help out a fellow employee. Marty loved a good conspiracy theory and was an all-around nice guy with a very colorful life and great stories to tell. Marty will be greatly missed by his co-workers. And in his honor, we'll just take a portion of a moment of silence. Thank you. Certainly, on behalf of the UTA family, we offer our condolences to Marty's family and are grateful for his service. Our first item up on our agenda today is our Safety First Minute. And with that, we invite a member of our safety team, Kent Muhlstein, to give that presentation. Good morning, Kent.
Thank you. Good morning. As we continue to balance the spread of COVID-19 cases in Utah with our economic recovery, it's important for us to focus on safety both inside and outside of the workplace as we move forward. So this month's safety poster theme is Return to Work Safely, and it shows what the new normal may look like. The poster depicts somebody walking out the door, grabbing their briefcase as part of their new normal routine. They also pick up a face covering, a mask on the way out the door. So what are some of the behaviors that we can continue to do to keep ourselves safe as part of this new normal? As part of the state's Safe to Work best practices, they continue to recommend that if you're experiencing symptoms of illness or fever, to stay home. Cover your cough and sneeze using your elbow or tissue to cover that up. Continue to practice physical distancing of at least 6 feet and use a mask to help prevent the spread. Regularly wipe down your work area to disinfect and sanitize frequently touched surfaces. Frequently wash your hands with soap and water for at least 20 seconds. And then focus on efforts to help protect at-risk populations such as the elderly and people with underlying health conditions. And as we continue to focus on those things, we can hopefully return to a new kind of normal and return to work. Thank you.
Thank you, Kent. It's a very timely message. We appreciate yours and the rest of the team's efforts to keep us safe and to remind us what we can do to keep ourselves safe. Our next item up is item 3 on our agenda, which is our consent agenda, which includes the approval of the minutes from May 20th. I'll look to one of my colleagues for a motion.
Mr. Chair, I'd like to make a motion that we approve the consent agenda, which includes the board minutes of May 20th.
Second.
I have a motion from Beth, seconded by Kent. All in favor, say aye.
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 Any opposed? That motion passes. Thank you. Next item up is our agency report with Carolyn Gannott. And Good morning, Carolyn. Welcome.
Good morning. Just wanted to give a brief update on sort of good news for the agency last week, where President Trump had tweeted about a $64.5 million allocation through the FTA program. This is for the Ogden-Weber State Bus Rapid Transit Project. This would extend from the Frontrunner Station and the Ogden Transit Center station up to Weber State University and then over to McCady Hospital. This actually does provide a lot of interconnectivity. We're hoping mirroring it very similar off to the UVX that we have down south. We do think it'll be a very successful bus rapid transit corridor for this area. Just to let you know, with the $64.5 million announcement, we still have some work to do. We still have to get the agreements done. There is a project grant agreement that will have to be completed after we have sort of our final cost estimates for the project and we're able to complete all the application work. We are hopeful that this project grant agreement will be advanced to Capitol Hill in October for the 10-day statutory review. That's what we're shooting for. And this will allow us to begin construction, which spurs both the local and the national economy by providing construction jobs and additional indirect and induced jobs. So we're looking forward. We're really excited that this was recognized by FTA in an allocation, which means if the project agreement gets signed, that money can flow to us in support of our construction for this project. So I just wanted to announce that. The second thing I wanted to say is just in general regarding the protests that have been going around Salt Lake City and other areas. We have just been very flexible and nimble with our service schedules and what we're doing in terms of trying to keep our customers safe. We did have some damage to the library station as well as a few bus stops areas, but we continue to try to monitor what's going on in the situation, be flexible to that. So I really want to thank all the staff for being able to be responsive, particularly Eddie and Chief Ross, Eddie Cummins, Chief Ross, and Lauren Simpson, because for the Salt Lake Business Unit. And that concludes my report. Are there any questions?
Carolyn, I did have one question, and I was just thinking about this morning as I was watching the news, and thinking, maybe doing a personal introspection and even wondering. And I know we do, Title VI analysis on service and things, but I wondered if we have, and some of the concerns raised by protesters and the concerns about fairness and equity. And I just wonder if we have sort of taken a look even at our own self, our operations, police, how we do citations. I'm not suggesting there's a problem, but you don't know what you don't know until you've looked at it. And it's one of those things. I don't even expect you to have an answer this morning, but I'm wondering if it's one of those things that, out of good stewardship, we just take a second look at that and see if there's anything we're just looking past incidentally.
Yeah, I do appreciate that, because I was actually thinking about the same, and just in general, aware of it within our workforce and what we are doing. So I was thinking about just maybe potentially working with the board on sending something out in terms of just, recognizing the gravity of the situation, and then, also just sort of being aware as a workforce and just in general as we conduct our daily business. So I would like to work with you on that. I was thinking the same thing, so I'm glad you brought that up.
Yeah, it's always healthy for us to, ask ourselves again, are we really covering what we should cover? So, any questions though for Carolyn? Okay.
Mr. Chair, I just, sorry, I was so slow on my mute. I just wanted to thank Carolyn and all the staff and all of the partners in the Ogden Bus Rapid Transit project that worked really hard for quite a while to make sure that this project can be successful and as connected as possible. Ogden City is one of our great partners in this, and they have done a great deal of work on this, as has Weber State and McKay Hospital, as well as some of the planning that they're doing for revitalizing their downtown areas and enhancing that even further. I know this is a long-term project, and it has it's coming to its final stages, and I just wanted to thank everyone for all of their hard work. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Thanks, Beth. Okay, well, Carolyn, thank you for that report, and thanks for you and your team's efforts these last few weeks. I know there's folks have really had to step up at times to keep things going, so we appreciate it. That brings us to number 5 on our agenda, which is the financial report for April of 2020, and with that, we'll turn to our Chief Financial Officer, Bob Biles. Good morning, Bob.
Good morning, and let's head toward the dashboard on the next slide and take a look. April, we're starting to see some of the impacts, but we didn't see some of the impacts we expected, actually. So look at sales tax, and this shows the distribution through May, and the May distribution was actually an increase of 5.5%. So again, think this is March. We expected sales tax to be down. It was actually up 5.5% from the prior year. So we're anxiously awaiting what April may look like and see if we'll have the kind of decreases that we were expecting in our pessimistic scenario going forward. So year to date on sales tax, you can see we're still favorable compared to budget. We expect that to reverse itself come April, when we do the next financial report. And so you can see down here below on sales tax our 12-month and 6-month tracking changes. There was initial decrease on the 6-month, but it actually went up a little bit last month, while the long-term 12-month, that decline wasn't as steep. Fare revenue is a little bit different story, and with the drop in passengers, of course, the fare revenue declined also. So for the month, we were down about $3 million. And overall, for the year, we're about $4 million below budget. We're going to talk about some of these in relation to the CARES Act funding in some slides coming behind this one. As far as operating expense, we had another good month. We were 2.3 million under budget, 9%. For the year, we're almost 9% under the budget. I'm sorry, almost 8.5% under budget, $8.9 million. As far as diesel price, April, we were $1.11. You remember a couple of months ago, we talked about at one point, we were down near $1 a few years ago. For May, it's the same amount. It was $1.11, but it brought that year-to-date actual. At the end of April, it was $1.61. At the end of May, it's actually $1.51. And then ridership, you can see, as we've been tracking, ridership's been down for the month and for the year. So if we can go to the next slide, we'll take a look at passenger revenues. And so we're going to add this slide just so we can track the passenger revenue and how it's affected as we go from month to month. And so you can see through February, we were actually ahead of budget, that many of the programs that we put in place in the last year or two were having some results. But then in March, we started to have a little bit of decline, and then April really showed that decline. And again, we're about 4.1 million under budget on revenue, just passenger revenue. Go to the next slide. We'll leave passenger revenues, head to sales tax collections. Again, this is through the March collection. The percentages are still fairly good. As you look at that, I expect those to decline as we move forward. But for the last 12 months, overall, we were 6% increase. And again, you can see the counties vary quite dramatically, with Utah County and Tooele County being more than double digit for the last 12 months. So if we go to the next slide, this is looking at sales tax revenues. You notice this is just through March. Passenger revenue went through April. March is all that we've received through May. And the key point on this slide, I think, is to notice the difference between actual and budget. In January, we know part of that was because they gave us February receipts in January. They accelerated some payments, but you can see the difference is declining month to month. So January, that number was a little bit over 5 million. In February, it was 4.3 million approximately. And here in March, we're above budget 2.8. So between February and March, we lost 1.6 million of that advantage on sales tax. Questions on that before we go to the next slide?
When do you anticipate getting, April's numbers? Is that a whole nother month or?
So typically we receive our distribution on the 22nd. With budget staff talking to state, trying to get an earlier indication of when they've tabulated April, they should be able to give us some indication of what that difference might be. There may be factors there that not everyone understands yet, so it's better just to wait until that distribution shows up, and then we know exactly what the change was. So around the 22nd of June, we'll know for sure what happened in April.
Okay, thank you.
So if you go to the next slide, we're keeping track of our revenue loss and our CARES funding estimates. And so what shows here through April is just the passenger revenue. Once we get our sales tax collections, you may start seeing a bar here for April. The green bar represents our estimated CARES eligible expense. The drawdown on the CARES funding, even though it's intended to be somewhat of a revenue replacement, that's one of the main reasons, you draw it down based on operating expenses or other eligible expenses. So at the end of April, it's 18.7 million that was eligible. And I understand we're going through the process of getting our our CARES funding approval. We're in the last phases of that. So hopefully sometime next week that will be approved and we can start drawing down these funds. And so, from a cash flow perspective, we want to see that our eligibility to draw down funds stays even with, or maybe even a little ahead of, our loss of revenue. So this is just a cash flow concern and making sure you understand where we sit on those cash flows.
And have there been have you had to look to reserves for actual cash during this period, or you been okay?
No, not at all. Actually, one of the things that Mary D. Loretta's group did is they accelerated the preventative maintenance grants that we typically get, and so we're drawing down on those now, and so that's been helpful too. And I get a daily cash report, and so every day I know how much money is available for our daily operations. We intentionally went short last year. You might remember we sold some of our investments and actually received a gain, and part of that intent was to keep our funds short. So that's been to our advantage. We had no idea this was going to happen. But as of this morning, I believe we had $115 million readily available to handle cash flow needs. So if you go to the next slide, we're also eligible for FEMA expenses. These are really the COVID-19 expenses, masks, cleaning equipment, cleaning supplies, the efforts that we've made to take care of our customers and our operators and others in the agency that are directly related to the COVID-19 expense. So we're tracking those through the end of April. It was about $120,000, and there would be FEMA should pay us about $90,000 of that. So we'll keep tracking that and report to you as we go along. So if we go to the next slide, we head over into the review of our 2020 expenses through April 30th. The only one that's negative here is maintenance of way, and that's a very small amount. And that's mainly due to some parts that they've been using. It's about $218,000 unfavorable variance on parts. Everyone else is favorable. Now, when you look at bus and commuter rail, some of that is due to savings in the diesel. So if we can go to the next slide, that was by mode. This is by chief officer. That's one of the things that the board's been interested in. And so here's the report. Again, everyone's favorable. And so again, this looks good. And then the last slide is looking at it by type. If you go advanced, yeah, there we go, by type. You know, even the one that's been difficult for us from time to time, parts warranty, that's even a little positive right now. And wages and benefits, again, it's positive too. So this all looks good. The fuel part of that, diesel, is 1.9 million. And so that's a quick review of the April financial statements. Did you have any questions?
Thanks, Bob. Beth? Yeah.
Sorry, thank you. Bob, I had a question. I wanted to know, on the eligible expenses that are covered by FEMA, how long does the FEMA, is the FEMA just a one-time expense allowance that we are able to get eligibility for, or is it an ongoing until some things change? And then I know that we're doing new processes as a result of that, and is that calculated in that as well?
Yeah, so the way I understand the FEMA expense is there's been a disaster declaration that lasts through, I believe, July 6th is the current designation. So expenses that are directly attributable to that disaster are FEMA eligible. And so we're just tracking those, and we started tracking these from the very beginning of that declaration. So there's not necessarily a limit or an allocation, it's just those expenses that qualify.
That qualify. Thank you.
Any other questions from the board on that? Okay. I think that's, Bob, you have some more? I'm sorry.
Nope, that's it on the
Okay.
April financial report.
All right, great. Thanks, Bob, for that report. We'll look forward to hearing how the following month goes. So, that brings us to item number 6 on our agenda, resolutions. And the first item is a resolution approving the second amendment of the authority's 2020 budget. And I know that we had a previous presentation and also a recent presentation to our UTA's Advisory Council. Bob, anything else on that budget amendment that has changed or modified?
Change. I just think for those who may not have been involved in our prior sessions, there's some small operating budget amendments, one for a UDOT grant that we got, and one moving some contingency from operating into the capital area. And then in the capital area, it's carrying forward some projects from last year. That's 49 million. There's 7 new projects, many of them grant funded. That's almost 10 million. There's some front runner and light rail state of good repair projects to help prepare for this coming winter. That's about 4 million. And then we had some projects that are going to, instead of being spent in 2020, they'll be spent in 2021. So we're moving 36 million from this year into next year.
Thank you for that recap. If there are no other questions, I would entertain a motion on this resolution.
Mr. Chair, I make a motion that we approve the resolution for the second amendment to the authority's 2020 budget. as has been detailed to us.
Second.
I have a motion from Kent, seconded by Beth. I'll ask for a roll call.
Trustee Holbrook,
Aye.
Trustee Millington,
Aye.
Chair Christensen.
Aye.
The vote is unanimous. Thank you.
Thank you. Next up is service and fare approvals, and the first item up there is Eco Trip Rewards Agreement with Salt Lake City Corporation. And good morning, Monica Martin is with us today to talk about that. Welcome.
Good morning, Mr. Chair and trustees. My request today is for approval of a fare revenue contract, and this is with Salt Lake City Corporation. So the current contract right now that we have with them allows us to provide transit passes to as many employees as would like. They basically do a pay per trip agreement, and that means that they pay for every trip at the current fare rate for every employee. And their employees are required to tap on and off, and at the end of the month, we generate a bill for them. So we anticipate the revenue amount to be approximately $135,000. This has dropped a little bit over last year, just a result of expectations we have over a lower ridership. And with your recommendation, I ask that we move forward in implementing and approving this contract. Do you have any questions?
Well, how common is that as far as a model where they actually pay the fare charge for using the thing? It's an intriguing one, and it probably helps the ones that just use it periodically. I just wondered, is it common?
We have just a handful, less than a dozen, actually probably about only 3 or 4 that participate. In this instance, Salt Lake City Corporation does not charge any of their employees. A couple of the other models we have, some employers do charge a very, very small fee for those that want to participate, but the model, it's not one of our more popular pricing models.
Okay. Yeah. Any other questions from the board? Seeing none, I would entertain a motion on this agreement.
Chair, I'd like to make a motion that we approve the Eco Trip Rewards Agreement with Salt Lake City Corporation.
Second.
I have a motion from Beth, seconded from Kent. All in favor, say aye.
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 Any opposed? That motion passes. Thank you, Monica. Appreciate
Thanks.
your help. Next item up is a continuation of a discussion we had a few months ago about our enterprise risk management plan. And with that, we would invite Dave Pitcher with UTA, as well as Bill Dykstra and Mark Maracini. I hope I got that right, Mark. But please correct me.
No, that was perfect. Thank you.
Dave, do you want to start the conversation?
Sure, thank you, and good morning, Chair and trustees. In May last year, under the direction of the board, a request for proposals was issued under the project name Risk Management Services. Proposals were received, and in June, Crow LLP was selected to provide the following. 1, a 2020 strategic risk assessment from which UTA could develop its internal audit plan. And 2, to identify the framework for an effective risk management program with recommendations for risk assessment tools applicable to the general transportation industry. Updates have been presented to the board and audit committee, as well as a presentation to the audit committee of the 2019 strategic risk assessment for formulation of the internal audit plan. Today, Bill Dykstra and Mark Maracini from Crow are online to present their report to the board. And after Crow's presentation, Carolyn would like to take some time to talk about Crow's recommendations. So I will turn the time over to Bill and Mark for presentation of their report to the board.
Thank you, David. This is Mark Maracini with Pro. I'm a partner with our public sector consulting practice. With me today, as mentioned, is Bill Dykstra. He's a manager in our public sector consulting practice. And we'll be walking through several areas of our project with you today. If we could move to the next slide. So we're going to start off again with just a quick high-level cover of the ERM background, recap some of the phases that we previously completed and presented on, and then get into what I'll call the meat of today's presentation, which would be discussing the current phases which have not been presented on, and then some of the next steps. Then lastly, we'll conclude our presentation and open it up for questions and answers. So if we could advance to slide 6, please. Yep, one more slide. Wonderful. So as David alluded to, UTA has been conducting an annual risk assessment on each year, and this has been performed by the Internal Audit Department. Last October, CRO was engaged to assist and help facilitate this risk assessment process. One of the things that we've noticed is, especially in today's environment, it's critical to look outside of the quote-unquote box, the normality of looking at what areas you want to assess risks in. Previously, compliance, financial, operational type risks were very prevalent. And now many organizations are starting to look at how do we pull in other risks? How do we pull in strategic type risks? Things of that nature. Some of the things that we're experiencing today, are events that we, might have never predicted, or might have never have thought happened. And how can we start predicting better? Or how can we start preparing better for these types of events going forward? So this enterprise risk management program, or this annual risk assessment, was really intended to be entity-wide. Was really intended to get outside of just those normal financial, operational, compliance type risks, and additionally look at other risks facing the organization. If we could please advance to the next slide. So one of the things that we would like to do within this is look at how we would establish an ERM program and what would provide the most value to the UTA. And there's several organizations that have provided frameworks and structure around an enterprise risk management program. And we have utilized those organizations and those standards to help build this program with the UTA. So one of those is COSO, and we feel that they provide a really strong ERM framework. So we have pulled in some of their information and made sure that the program that we've developed for you is COSO compliant. One of the other ones is OMB. Now OMB has dictated a program that federal agencies are required to follow. However, considering that UTA receives a sufficient amount of federal funding, we felt that incorporating and making sure that the program is aligned with the OMB standards will help the organization down the road as things change, and potentially as the federal government looks at how they could better understand how state and local and special districts are handling their risk assessments and their risk approach, their ERM program. So we felt it was important to incorporate both of those programs and into this to make sure that UTA is compliant with them. If we could please move to the next slide. So as I alluded to, the first step was performing that annual risk assessment and looking at risks as a holistic level or entity-wide. And really what an ERM program intends to do is it wants to improve decision-making processes. Many organizations in the past operate in silos for the most part, where departments may look at their own risks and determine how they want to address their risks and what goals they may have for their department. What an ERM program really looks to do is quote unquote break down those silos, have a cohesive entity making decisions, as one unit, and looking at how individual business risks, business department risks, and business department goals and strategy roll up and align with the overall goals and strategy of the organization. Again, so this would help encourage more open communication across the various units within UTA and help the process of making decisions as a cohesive unit. If we may please move on to the next slide. The next area that we would like to discuss is just a recap of the first couple phases 1 through 3, that we performed and presented already, but I just wanted to cover a very high level, just so when we start with phase 4, we all have that background information fresh in our minds. So the first phase involved really understanding UTA, how UTA operates. In order to create a successful ERM program, you really want to understand the organization, how decisions are made within an organization, how the organization operates and functions, and understanding the organization's true strategic objectives and goals. So as part of that, we created a project plan that laid all of this out. We shared this project plan with UTA to gain concurrence that we were on the same page with what our product would be and what our deliverables would be. And next, we collected a series of documents and performed some research on our own of various industry trends and things of that nature across the transit industry. We reviewed that documentation to obtain a true understanding of UTA and your operations. If we may move on to the next slide, please. The next phase involved what we call our on-site portion. And this is where we took the knowledge we gained from the documentation we reviewed, and we conducted a series of interviews with board members and also with management of UTA to understand what they viewed as the key risks facing the organization, how they currently were managing those risks, and any other gaps potentially that they saw where risks might present an area that could be enhanced for the organization. So we were on site for these, as I mentioned, and we conducted a series of interviews and gathered all of that information, which then fed into our next phase, phase 3. And if we could advance the slide, please. And this is where we took the information from the interviews and created what we call a risk register, which is basically a listing of risks in which management felt were important to the organization. Next, we conducted a risk forum, and this was an in-person forum. This was prior to, of course, all of the COVID-19 stuff, as you can see by the date there, last December. During this forum, we asked management to rank the risks by impact and likelihood. Management went through that process of ranking each of the risks, and from that we took the results and we analyzed the results or compiled the results to prepare what we call the overall assessment or risk assessment. If we could please move to the next slide. One of the concepts that we felt before we get into the results of this assessment that's critical in understanding the nature of risk assessments is the concept of inherent risk versus residual risk. And this is an important concept because inherent risk ignores any types of controls. So regardless of how many internal controls you may have in place for a certain process, or how much mitigation strategy you may have in place for a certain risk, inherent risk ignores that. Whereas residual risk takes that into account. So inherent risk would be just your risk without any controls and mitigation strategy. And then residual risk would say, okay, how much risk is remaining after considering all of the controls in place and all of the mitigation strategies that UTA would have in place. Now, for an initial risk assessment, though, or an annual risk assessment, you would want to look at just inherent risk first. because that would be critical, because you wouldn't want to take a look at just residual risk first, because you may have controls in place today that may change down the road. And you would want to make sure those types of items are not falling off the radar to the point where you're deeming it a low risk because you have so many controls in place today, but a year from now those controls go away or change or whatever the case may be, and now this one's not really on your radar. So this assessment was performed using inherent risks. So we could, this initial assessment, so we could capture all of those inherently to the organization. At this point, I would like to hand this off to Bill Dykstra to talk about some of the results.
Quickly go over the results here. As you can see on this heat map, it might be a little difficult to read the text, so I'll go through it on the next slide to show you what the top 11 risks that came out and how they were ranked. If we could advance, yeah, thank you very much. So this is where those risks that we had compiled as being of the utmost importance to management were ranked from an inherent risk perspective. So as Mark was saying, this is prior to the consideration of what controls and risk mitigation strategies that UTA currently has in place. And again, it's offered as a baseline, and it's offered to indicate where the focus should really be, where the prioritization should be from an entity-wide perspective. So as you can see, we have included risks such as cybersecurity attacks, the state of good repair being a critical area to maintain, any sort of disaster or emergency events, as we've unfortunately have experienced over the past few months, any fraud or illegal activity, any harm to people or property, that includes employees, contractors, customers, anyone that has contact with UTA and its services. Lack of any reliable data. Data is important to drive the decision-making process, and as we indicated, that is one of the primary purposes for an enterprise risk management program, and for it to be effective, you have to have good data to share that information. Next was turnover in key positions or in skilled positions due to market conditions. The next one would be reduced funding due to legislative activity, due to ridership, or a multitude of other causes. Cash shortfalls, which would be a risk for any entity. Having a cash shortfall could really impact daily operations. And next was conflicting board and management priorities, where this would be as the direction, looking at the direction of the organization as a whole, making sure that the board and the management team are aligned and working toward the same goals and strategies. And then finally, failure to meet service or expansion plans. This is pertaining to the growth and expansion plans that the region expects from UTA, and then its constituents expect, and meeting those expectations would be critical to the success of the organization. So that's just a quick recap of what the results were and how they were ranked. If we could move to the next slide, we'll get into the next phases. So these were the ones that were not yet discussed. So this would be phase 4 and phase 5. So far, we've covered the first 3 phases, which got us through deliverable 1, which was to complete that enterprise risk assessment to help inform the internal audit plan for this year, and also to help serve as a basis or a starting point for the enterprise risk management framework. So if we could advance to the next slide. The enterprise risk management program typically operates on a cycle, and that is inclusive of 5 phases. There's various frameworks that that segment this in different ways, but using the COSO framework, which is widely accepted and recognized globally, we use these 5 to really structure this program and its cycle. So using this, we got through the identification, the assessment, and the prioritization of risk in phases 1 through 3. They correlated with these first 3 phases of an ERM cycle. The next 2 phases of our program are looking at how the organization responds to risk, and then how it reviews the program as a whole and how those mitigation plans are working, and makes adjustments as necessary. Phase 4 and 5 of this project also correlate to enabling UTA to complete the cycle, phases 4 and 5 of the cycle. Next slide, please. So again, the deliverables relate directly to the accomplishment and the completion of an entire ERM process cycle, and helping to form the fundamentals, the structure, the documentation, the materials, the references needed to make that plan, that program sustainable for years to come. So I'll demonstrate how that works in the next few slides and what we've done. So phase 4, the risk management practices evaluation phase. We started with the results of the risk assessment and went back and did another round of interviews and another round of research to really drill into what are the existing risk mitigation activities that UTA has in place. What are the existing controls to mitigate those risks, those top 11 risks? We met with the subject matter experts, the owners, if you will, of those areas that pertain to those risks. Cybersecurity, for example, we met with IT personnel. Data reliability, we met with the data analytics team, the business intelligence team, and so on and so forth, to really get an understanding of what is currently in place. So we had a sense of where the residual risk may lie. Based on that understanding, we developed what we call a gap analysis. We lined up the risks to the controls that are currently in place and looked to see, based on our knowledge, based on best practices and what we've uncovered, were there any gaps in controls? Were there any weaknesses, areas that could be improved? And where we did identify opportunities for improvement, we would make recommendations for management to look at, to consider, as they pursue that response phase of the ERM management cycle. So we can move on to the next one. So again, our recommendations were intended to offer suggestions for management to develop responses to those risks. As you remember, the response phase is phase 4 of the ERM cycle, and that's typically executed in the form of management action plans or some sort of mitigation strategies to specifically identify how the organization is going to respond or manage or mitigate that risk to an acceptable level. In turn, we then started to develop those supporting materials to help management develop those action plans, to give them a framework to use as a basis for this. And we developed the program framework itself to help them implement those mitigation strategies. That involves the framework, the policies, the procedures, various templates, and implementation guides to help make this a sustainable program. And again, these are based on primarily the COSO framework. And we can move to the next one. So phase 5 is our reporting phase, and this is the culmination of where we identified and made recommendations to management for the response phase, as well as delivering those framework components. So on the list here, you see what we delivered to management on April 30th. That included our overall report of the program and what we've developed and what we did. Also our risk profile and analysis, which is a detailed analysis, including the recommendations that were included in the report for those top 11 risks. We also drafted a program framework for management to take as a starting point and to use to tailor it to further meet their specific needs. That framework included policies, best practices. It included risk management committee charter draft, a draft risk appetite statement. Risk appetite statements are typically used to identify management's willingness or capacity to take on risks and is useful as a baseline when doing risk assessments. We also provided a risk rating methodology, a risk scoring template matrix, if you will, to help management conduct those risk assessments in a consistent fashion. We also provided a template for management to develop action plans to address the top 11 risks and to lay out those strategies. And also a glossary of key terms. This is a best practice to have common language amongst the ERM program and those involved so that everyone understands the information that's being communicated and everyone uses the same terminology. So we provided that as well. And then finally, we provided a presentation that could be used as a training implementation guide, a reference. It provides best practices, tips, and cautionary guidelines for especially the early on implementation of an ERM program. So that was the deliverable in that reporting phase. So I'll conclude then with just a few items to recap. What are the key components of the framework that we included in the guide and also in the report, and what we think are valuable takeaways for management as they move forward in implementing the ERM program. And the first three involve very high level, tone at the top sort of components. For example, the sponsorship, really considering at the top of the organization who's driving the program, who's behind it, who's supporting it. Is it funded? Does it have the resources to be successful? And then is it clear who's responsible for the success of the program? Also in governance, the point of ERM, or one of the main points as we discussed earlier, is to improve decision making and to share information and break down silos. So an important concept to remember is to be cognizant of what is being done with this information that's produced. Who's it being reported to, and what decisions are based on this information? And that's one of the key ways to really be able to evaluate if your program is working or not. And then also shared fundamentals, having that structure in place, having everyone understand it and follow it in terms of what the policies are, what the risk management committee is structured like, who the risk owners are, roles and responsibilities that go along with that, and then finally the common language and definitions is important to maintain consistency and sustainability. Next slide, please. Repeatable process. This isn't a put on the shelf and one and done exercise, if you will. It's meant to be more of a mindset, and embedding this into the way that the organization does business and makes decisions. That's the repeatable process component of it. It's also meant to have accountability and transparency without being punitive. It's meant to encourage the open sharing of information, even if it involves some risks and some challenges and some threats. To be able to identify those, prioritize them, and then respond to them accordingly. And then finally, flexibility and modification to the plan is important. I have never seen or heard of any organization that gets it 100% right out of the box. This is a program that takes continuous monitoring, evaluation, and adjustment to make it work. Next slide. And then once again, a lot of these concepts involve just embedding it into processes and the way that the organization makes decisions. And a lot of these risk management and controls and mitigation strategies already exist. It's a matter of building onto those things and embedding them into processes like strategic planning, like budgeting, major project planning, things like that, where risk becomes a part of the discussion. Next slide. So with that, we're going to conclude our presentation. We've completed our objectives. We've provided the risk assessment. We've provided the program framework. And I will turn it over to Mark to have any final comments on our presentation.
Thank you, Bill. And I just wanted to say with this project that everyone at UTA, board, management, every staff we dealt with was really engaged in this process. And that is critical to the success of not only this project, but also the overall performance of the program. So I would just like to thank everyone at UTA for your commitment and for being engaged and being so cooperative throughout this process and helping make this project a success and also hopefully this program a success for you. And then now I'll just open it up for any questions you may have.
So
Let's see, Carolyn, did you want to mention something?
for myself, yeah, just in general, I appreciate all Crow's work on this. It's important to us. I wanted to talk a little bit. They've mentioned a lot of what things can be done and the tools that they sort of will be leaving with us. But I did want to talk a little bit about some of the plans going forward, just real quickly. So one of them is we've been talking about establishing an enterprise risk management policy. So I think that's one of the first things we would try to take a look at. Part of that is defining the key roles of all, our agency, which includes the board, which primarily monitor the effective management of those risks against the organizational objectives. But in general, the executive director or myself would be really the owner and the project sponsor of the ERM program, and make sure we have the support and the resources, and that would be also working with the board. We are, as you know, been out, we put a little hold on it right now, but the Director of Risk and Compliance, that position would actually help develop and administer the ERM program. So we would be, once this was completed, which will be going forward, we will be now sort of going back into pursuing that position to help manage the ERM process. The other thing is developing, as I mentioned, sort of a risk management committee, which is really executive level managers charged with the oversight and the governance and developing some of these, working with the Director of Risk and Compliance. I think it's really important for, as Bill mentioned, is that it needs to be embedded within the decision making and within our processes. It shouldn't be something that's a side note and a check. Have we done it? It needs to be sort of thought about throughout. Plus, if it becomes too unwieldy, it becomes sort of an effort that people will end up wanting to avoid, and it won't get done, and it will get muted. So we do need to try to figure out how does it get incorporated to all of our processes. And then the next piece would be, as I mentioned, when we established the Enterprise Risk Management Committee, I think what's most important that it really does become sustainable over time, and that is through what they talked about, embedding the consideration of the risk and the risk management into the VTA's key planning and decision-making processes, and that we continue to monitor that. So we are looking forward to moving forward. We do have a lot of information that they left us that I've gone through, and a lot of the stuff is a lot of work at the front end, but I think could be very appropriate in the long run in terms of how we sort of manage our risk. And then I think it would also really be allow us to have a stronger partnership with the internal auditor and defining what those risks are and having audits of those areas. And are we following the policies, those areas we see high? I think it will be able to strengthen that partnership more if we have an ERM program. So just wanted to let you know that we will be sort of moving forward on this, and any comments that you have or questions for Crow or comments for us, I appreciate. Thank you.
Thanks, Carolyn. I know you were in the hiring process for that risk manager. Are you starting again, or feel like you have candidates? What do you sort of think is your timetable?
Well, but probably I would hope by the end of the summer. I hate to say that, by August or somewhere in August, we'll be taking a look at that as well, in time for really what the budget considerations would be and the budget being put in front of the board.
Sure. Okay. Other questions from the board? Brian? Yeah. I think I'm seeing any. Maybe one question for either Mark or Bill. Is what's being discussed, with the risk manager and those kind of things, and then using current executive staff, is that generally the model you see in responsive to some of these recommendations?
Yes. So there's usually a champion that would be identified that would own the program, whether it's a chief risk officer or whatever the case may be. We also see a lot of times that in addition to that position, a committee's developed that would represent across the various business departments and units of the organization that would have more periodic meetings to continue engaged in the program and discuss risks and activities and move forward the program. But yeah, so we usually see one champion, a lot of times a chief risk officer type position that would own the program.
Great, thank you. Beth, did you have a question or?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair.
Sorry.
I had a question about, so I read the report and it's pretty detailed, and I know we have those top 11 areas, and they're divided by high priority, elevated, and moderate. In a typical, I think you used the term COSO is the acceptable framework of how this is looked at. What do you basically take a look at anything that's at a high level and just kind of start throwing resources and everything else at those high level ones first, or do you focus on the entire and work it in that accordingly? I know that like cybersecurity is the number one, and that's going to always be constantly evolving because we're going to have to keep adapting. But just overall, how does that look?
Yeah, so again, just a good question, and just a couple things to keep in mind as I answer that. The first thing is that, again, that initial landscape and that high, elevated, moderate ratings were based on inherent risk, right? So again, this is not looking at anything you already have in place, any controls you already have in place, really just looking at, day one of an organization, what are the top things we need to be concerned about? So from a response standpoint, you don't necessarily want to look at that for how you're developing your responses and which responses you want to attack first. So what we presented here today, that's just stuff you want to keep on the radar and make sure you're continuously assessing, what you're doing. From a response standpoint, that would have been part of what we had in phase 4 and culminated in phase 5, as Bill pointed out in our report to management. And we provided some recommendations in there. We also provided some thoughts on the what I'll call rankings of those recommendations of what the organization may or may not want to look at first. But with those, correct, a lot of times we'll find that if the recommendations or what we call the residual risk is higher, you would want to focus on those areas first and make sure those those are shored up because they might be beyond your risk appetite at the end of the day and be at a point where it's not acceptable for that risk. So you would want to focus on those first. Did that sufficiently answer your question?
Yes, it did. Thank you.
Seeing no other questions, thank you, Mark and Bill, for your efforts, and especially Dave. Thanks for kind of shepherding this through the process. And Dave, did you have anything else, or?
Nope, I don't have anything else on this. Thank you very much.
Okay, great. We'll look forward, Carolyn, as you get through the hiring process, and certainly want to be supportive as we go forward with this. This brings us up to discussion item number B, which is a discussion with the Central Wasatch Commission, an overview and an update. And we really appreciate them. They responded to a request to sort of shift them to an earlier meeting, and they've been great about that. And we have Laura Hanson, our chief planning, our planning director, and Ralph Becker, who's the executive director of the Central Wasatch Commission. I also know Chris Robinson, who's their chair, is with us as well, and as Blake Perez from the staff of the Central Wasatch Commission. So with all that, good morning, and I'll maybe turn the time to Laura to start the conversation and then go from there.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair and members of the board. We're appreciative of you making some time on your agenda for this update today. I am joined today by Summit County Council member Chris Robinson, who is the chair of the Central Wasatch Commission, Ralph Becker, who's the executive director, and Blake Perez, who is the deputy director. The CWC is an interlocal cooperation of cities and counties that touch the Wasatch Mountains. Their mission is to implement the recommendations of the Mountain Accord, or to facilitate the implementation of that. Although UTA is not a member of the CWC today, they've been incredibly collaborative in including us in lots of conversations as a key stakeholder. And so we've really enjoyed a good collaborative working relationship with them over the last year or so. One of our biggest successes recently was the work that we did together to increase bus service up the canyons during the last ski season. That resulted in about a 30% increase in ridership on the bus service last year. So we're really excited about that and continuing to work with the CWC. Another project that they are starting up is a mountain transportation strategy. And we've been included as a key stakeholder and participant in that planning process as well. So I'd love to give them some time to introduce the CWC, the work that they're doing, talk a little bit about some governance changes that they're contemplating. And with that, I'll turn the time over to Ralph. Thanks so much.
Laura, thank you, and members of the board, we appreciate being with you. Chris Robinson was having some technical difficulties. I don't know if he's been able to, I know he's watching, but he was trying to be able to speak. So Chris, if you're there, just holler and I'll be happy to.
Yeah, I'm here. I don't know if I'm muted or not. Can you hear me?
We can. Do you want to go ahead and get started, Chris?
Sure. I would just want to start out first by thanking you trustees and staff. I know that you've got a lot on your plate as you try to figure out how to navigate the state's transit system, its main one, and lots of challenges. And so taking time for the CWC is very much appreciated. We've had a staff relationship with Laura, almost like a monthly, if not more frequent, standing meeting, and have really appreciated the collaboration. And also I want to reemphasize what Laura mentioned about the work we did collectively to increase bus service in the canyons this past winter. It was a big success, and it was kind of a small thing that yielded big fruit. And so thank you for that. And we have done a little bit of a recalibration. as you may know, part of the Mountain Accord recommendations were that there be a federal designation for the Cottonwood Canyons and for the Central Wasatch, where, in fact, Jason Chaffetz, when he was the then representative, introduced a bill to create the National Recreation and Conservation Area Act for the Central Wasatch. And it would have created more protections and facilitated some transportation and transit. But what we've determined is that that bill and what or anything like it needs to kind of go on the side burner while we deal with the big problem in the Wasatch, which is transportation. And the solution is going to be, in our opinion, more transit. So what we are trying to do with this, as Laura referred to it as a mountain transportation strategy, or what we call a mountain transportation system, is to work in parallel with what UDOT is doing with its Little Cottonwood Canyon EIS, but to look more holistically at the Central Wasatch and see if we can come up with a consensus recommendation for a blueprint for mountain transportation. And so I'd like for Blake to take some time and briefly describe what we're doing with what we call the MTS, or Mountain Transportation System. And then, Ralph, if you could share some thoughts on what we're doing with our interlocal agreement and some governance changes. Blake, are you there for?
I'm here. Yep. Thank you, Chris. Thank you, trustees. This year, the Central Wasatch Commission is embarking on a year-long process to further refine and develop the transportation principles and initiatives outlined in the Mountain Accord. Our goal is to arrive at a proposed comprehensive year-round transportation system that includes the Salt Lake Valley. You can see here the Big and Little Cottonwood Canyons, Parley's Canyon, and connections to the Wasatch Back. The stakeholders and the public are invited to engage at every juncture during the process. And earlier this year, we released an initial scope, goals, and attributes document, which was opened up for a public comment period, and we refined that. We have a report on our website with the public comments and staff recommendations. We've finalized our attributes and our goals, and we are looking at a mountain transportation system to be effective, economically effective and efficient in moving people to their desired locations, and a system that should be affordable, accessible, and safe for its users while minimizing negative impacts on the watershed, ridgelines, air quality, visual quality, while enhancing the experience of visiting the Central Wasatch Mountains. Recently, we have put together our technical working group, which includes staff members from UTA, including Laura. And we are working with additional vendors and experts, including UDOT, Doppelmayr, Stadler Rail, WFRC, staff members from Summit County and Park City, WFRC, if I haven't included them already. And we will be evaluating and developing various modes, corridors, and management strategies to achieve those goals. And like I said earlier, we're hoping to do this by the end of the year. It is a fast process, and we are working, like Chair Robinson mentioned earlier, we're working in parallel with the UDOT EIS, and the information that they'll be providing with us in a week's time will be critical as we put this jigsaw puzzle together. And of course, we'll be engaging with our Stakeholders Council, which is a group of our 31 members representing various interests and organizations and businesses within the Central Wasatch Mountains, and we'll be engaging them throughout the process. Our next steps for us, like I said, over the next few months will be to develop several possibilities that we will go out to the public. We'd like to hear back from the public on their preferences. And then later this fall, we'll be hosting a Mountain Transportation System Summit, where we will hopefully come to consensus on a recommended transportation system. And that will happen, like I said, later in the fall, and then will be forwarded on to the Central Wasatch Commission for consideration.
But can I ask you a question on that? As it goes through the process, will those sort of recommendations flow into ultimately into the regional transportation plan, or how do they get implemented since you don't have statutory, oversight of transportation?
Great question, Mr. Chair. We've talked with WFRC, and what we hope to come to is a recommendation that will be further pursued with any NEPA or EIS process, and hopefully adopted by WFRC's transportation plans, long-term plans, in addition to Summit County and Park City. So what we're hoping to come to at the end is more of a policy recommendation for further development and refinement and implementation. The main goal, Mr. Chair, is to come to a consensus to Mountain Accord on a regional mountain transportation system.
Thank you.
Maybe I could, if you'd like, I could move on to the interlocal agreement. I'll just add to what Blake and Chris have said. Those of you who followed or were involved, as I know some of you have been with Mountain Accord, know that the approach was to seek consensus, and in Mountain Accord that was successful. We're seeking the same kind of consensus locally, across the board, including the local jurisdictions and the stakeholders, which includes the ski areas and the conservation groups. Needless to say, that's a tall task, and there's a reason that, as all of you know who've been involved with transportation in these mountains, there's a reason the consensus hasn't been reached for over 30 years, even though the problems have just continued to get worse. But we were successful, obviously, in Mountain Accord. We've got all the players at the table, and I think, with the critical sort of delays that people face through traffic congestion in trying to enjoy these and gain access to these mountains, that this is an opportune time. So we'll see how we do, but I think we're off to a good start. So we'll see what happens there. Turning to another matter, the Central Wasatch Commission was formed and operates through an interlocal agreement under Utah statutes, where all of the local governments have come together and are represented by their elected officials serving as the Board of Commissioners. We have 8 and about to become 9 members, with the town of Brighton in the process of joining the board maybe as soon as next month. To be able to add Brighton, the way the Interlocal Government Act works for Utah and for our commission, is that every one of the jurisdiction's legislative bodies has to approve any changes. So as members have been added, it's required an amendment or amendments to the interlocal agreement. We've been in discussions with your chair as we've looked to best involve UTA and maybe some other entities who aren't elected officials in a way that directly involves them in the deliberations and really the actions of the Central Wasatch Commission. What we've come up with is to have an ex officio status for non-elected officials. UDOT was a member of the Central Wasatch Commission Carlos Braceras, I know all of you know, was always very uncomfortable as the only unelected official. And so we've arrived at an approach that we think maybe is more comfortable for non-elected officials to participate very directly as members of the commission. So we've also provided in the amendments to the interlocal agreement with Brighton's addition for an ex officio status for up to 4 members. We've been discussing that from the time we started considering it with Carlton and with some of the other agencies about that status, and Carlton, appreciate that you've been very supportive of that work, and that the UTA trustees have included a budget item for participation with the CWC in that kind of classification. And as Laura mentioned, the UTA is at the heart of what we are looking at for solutions with mountain transportation. So it's possible that as soon as July 1st that the agreement will be completed. All of the jurisdictions, local jurisdictions, legislative bodies, but one have now adopted the changes to the interlocal agreement, and that last jurisdiction's scheduled to take it up June 11th. So we're looking towards a future with UTA's not just involvement as you have been involved, but really as a potential formal member if it continues to be desired by UTA. And we'll see how that unfolds. But we've been working through the process. You can imagine with 9 legislative bodies of local governments, that hasn't been simple, but it's gone very smoothly. And we've also really appreciated that all of those local governments have continued to provide the membership dues, really to continue to further the mission of the Central Wasatch Commission. So that's where we are with that. We've really appreciated, as Chair Robinson mentioned, a very close and I'll say thorough working relationship with UTA. Those bus service improvements for the ski buses this last winter, really the decisions were made over a very short period of time, but we've seen some real success. Who knows with the conditions we're in today, how that will unfold for next season, but I know we're looking forward to those continuing kinds of improvements.
Thank you, Ralph. Beth and I, as former city council members, could say both of our councils were always in harmonious agreement on every issue, right? Yeah. Hardly.
So true.
Ralph, how do you and I know that just even the creation of the Central Wasatch was a big lift in a couple areas, and kudos to you and to others who have gotten it to this point. Do you feel like it is accomplishing sort of that implementation of the Mountain Accord and other issues as they come forward that had been hoped?
Yeah, I'll certainly welcome Chris and Blake commenting on this as well, but I will say it has. I joined as the first staff member for the Central Wasatch Commission, joined the commission 2 years ago. And Mountain Accord really had 2 primary thrusts. One was to get additional land protections in place through congressional legislation, and the other was to address and help address the transportation issues, and then to serve as a coordinating body for local governments and stakeholders and other agencies. My wish would have been that we could have moved faster, but the wheels of government grind slowly. And particularly where we're working with, congressional and just the conditions in Washington, D.C., it is really tough to get things done. And so while we've, I think, continued to achieve pretty good consensus, not unanimity by any means, and not without bumps on the road, those stakeholders and obviously local governments continue to work closely together. But as Chris mentioned, we've put the legislation on the side burner because our congressional delegation and the governors, with the way transportation became so congested in the Wasatch, have said, well, why aren't you guys solving that problem? So we've put the legislation, which really had reached a point that we felt was about ready for introduction. We put it on a side burner and are focusing attention on the mountain transportation system. So I feel like we're making progress. Is it as fast as someone like me would like? No, but I'm not a very patient person when it comes to seeing things get done. But I think we're doing really well, and we've the commission, I think, in its wisdom, last fall at a retreat said, let's break up our commission into 3 areas of focus. One, on continuing to work on some issues with the federal legislation. Second, this mountain transportation system. And third, to invest more in some short-term projects that we know are desperately needed in the Wasatch. We're making progress in all of those areas. The commission just in the last month has approved almost $100,000 in projects that are way behind schedule. The Forest Service has no capacity to keep up with addressing recreation impacts and recreation use in the canyon. So CWC with others is stepping forward to help try to address that. So I feel like we're making progress, I guess, in short. Is it as fast as I would like? No. Is it maintain that sort of consensus progress that was reflected in Mountain Accord? I think we can feel good that continues every day. Chris, I don't know if you or Blake want to add anything to that. I just wanted to respond directly.
Well, I would say that we did have consensus at the original accord, but on the issue of transportation, I'm going to use the term we punted, where it was the big, elephant in the room, and it's a thorny topic because different modes and methods have different detractors and supporters. And so we got ahead of ourselves on the federal legislation, and we realized that we're not going anywhere with it until some significant plans, if not actual gains, are made on the transportation front. And it's not easy work, and our coalition, I'll call it, has frayed some, but we think that it can be brought back together. And as I said, even at our apex, when we signed the accord in July of 2015 or 16, whenever it was, there were the transportation part was sort of whitewashed over a little bit and left for another day. And that other day has arrived. And while we have no, jurisdictional authority, and while we're not following NEPA or in a process to lead to a project, we are, as Blake pointed out, working to come up with a system that we can get support around that could then be recommended to those that do have jurisdictional authority. And so we still think it's very important work. The Wasatch is more beloved than ever, and the pressures on it, especially in accessing it, are greater than ever. And so the challenges, continue to grow, and we're trying to be a positive solution, or a portion of the solution.
Thank you. Thanks for that insight. Let me just look to my colleagues and if they have any questions or guests.
No questions, but just a comment. You've certainly bit off a lot here to chew on, and congratulations in making the progress that you have. This is not an easy solution. I know at the time this was originally proposed, I was on the Transportation Commission, so I was looking at it from the other side, from the UDOT side, and I was involved in some of those discussions. So I think you've made admirable progress, frankly, given the problem that exists. So congratulations. Good work.
Thanks, Ken.
Thank you.
Beth, did you have a question?
I didn't have a question either, but I did want to make a comment. I think that this has really evolved, and I think that by looking at this in the way that you guys have outlined it, I think there's really some potential here. We know that we still have all of this growth that is, maybe it's a little bit on hold due to recent events, but for the most part, we know that this is going to continue to be a challenge for everyone. And so I just wanted to say good job and thank you. This looks good.
Thank you.
Thank you. Laurie, any follow-up there?
In relation to what your board member Holbrook said, that I was just looking at some information this morning, and I can tell you we see it directly. With COVID-19, parks and recreation use has gone up 100%. And I think we all understand why. And so while we don't really know how we're going to react to it, I think every indication is that while it may change in form or in how people access the mountains, the demand for what these mountains provide is only increasing.
Good point. Thank you. Laura, did you have any follow-up, or are you good?
No, thank you, Mr. Chair. I will continue to collaborate and work with CWC, and would be happy to come back and give you an update on our progress at an appropriate time in the future.
All right, great. Our next item is other business, which is our next meeting of the 17th of June. This note a slightly different time change to 10:30 a.m. due to some commitments with an interim transportation committee presentation. As we adjourn, I just need to correct myself from the beginning of the meeting and misstating of our employee's name. Martin Beaver is the correct pronunciation, and I apologize to his family, and certainly as we adjourn, we do so in Martin's honor. So with that, I would entertain a motion for adjournment.
So moved.
Second.
Motion and a second. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? That motion adjourns, and we'll stand adjourned. Thank you, everyone.